Hi, and welcome to another episode of About the Authors TV. I'm your host, Jake Brown. Declared one of America's most popular suspense novelists, literary legends like Dean Koontz come along once in a lifetime. Casting one of the most influential shadows over modern horror, suspense, science fiction, thriller, fantasy, and paranormal, among other genres, with over 500 million books sold around the world over an amazing 60-plus year career, 100-plus books, and 17 film adaptations to date of his singular catalog of works. His way with words helped shape modern genres like science fiction, of which he's considered a pioneer, lifting off way back in 1968 with StarQuest and creating his first prolific period of catalog output with short stories and novels that followed, like Fear That Man, Beast Child, Anti-Man, The Crimson Witch, Starblood, The Fall of the Dream Machine, The Dark Symphony, Time Thieves, Warlock, and Hell's Gate before blending science fiction and horror for the first time in Demon Seed. Launching a new era and subgenre in the process, popularly known today as horror fiction, in which he's considered a forefather courtesy of chilling page-turners like Night Chills, The Face of Fear, The Vision, The Key to Midnight, The Voices of Midnight, Lightning, and Whispers. Next exploding into a household name in the 1980s with a new run of best-selling horror masterpieces like The Funhouse, The Eye of Darkness, The Mask, The House of Thunder, Phantoms, Watchers, Shadowfires, The Bad Place, Cold Fire, Hideaway, Dragon Tears, Mr. Murder, Dark Rivers of the Heart, Intensity, TikTok, Soul Survivor, False Memory, and One Door Away from Heaven. Along with other Koontz classics like A Darkness in My Soul, Chase, Darkfall, Dragonfly, Fear Nothing, Darkness Comes, Hanging On, Invasion, Midnight, The Nameless series, Nightmare Journey, Prisoner of Ice, Seize the Night, Shattered, Strange Highways, Strangers, The Chase, The Door to December, The Servants of Twilight, Time Thieves, Twilight Eyes, Winter Moon, Darkest Desires, Final Hour, and Last Light. Koontz would kick off a new century of hits in the millennium with new bestsellers like From the Corner of His Eye and By the Light of the Moon, and has remained as influential and popular as ever with new generations of readers and writers, courtesy of bestsellers more recently like The Face, The Taking, Life Expectancy, Velocity, The Husband, The Good Guy, The Darkest Evening of the Year, Your Heart Belongs to Me, Relentless, Breathless, Darkness Under the Sun, What the Night Knows, The Moonlit Mind, 77 Shadow Street, Wilderness, Innocence, The Neighbor, The City, Ashley Bell, Ricochet Joe, Devoted, the wildly popular Odd Thomas series featuring Forever Odd, Brother Odd, Odd Hours, Odd Interlude, Odd Apocalypse, Deeply Odd, You Are Destined to Be Together Forever, and Saint Odd, the Frankenstein series featuring Prodigal Son, City of Night, Dead and Alive, Lost Souls, and Dead Town, the Jane Hawk series co-starring The Silent Corner, The Whispering Room, The Bone Farm, The Crooked Staircase, The Forbidden Door, and The Night Window, and standalones that kicked off the 2020s like Elsewhere, Quicksilver, and The Big Dark Sky. We're almost speechless that he's here today to talk about all of it. Mr. Koontz, I, like so many viewers and millions of fans around the world, have been one of yours since childhood. Thank you so much for being here. The show would not have been complete without you. You once said that metaphysics are the ink of your pen, and we'd love to begin by exploring a bit about how that translates onto the page as you're working.
There's lots of things that matter in fiction. Certainly storyline does, characters more than story in my mind, but also what is going on in the story, what else is happening subtextually. That is something that's always been, as a reader and as a writer, of greater interest to me almost than anything else in the book. And so when I'm getting into a story, I always start with, okay, what is this about on a subtextual level? What does this say about meaning of life or our place in the universe or the mysterious quality of life? That alone, with no answers as to what it means, can give you a lot of material. And then that centers me on what is this book really about underneath what all it appears to be about. And then as you write it, of course, it changes. The characters go places, the story takes turns that you're not quite anticipating. And then that whole metaphysical part of it, that whole mysterious element that you don't fully control, goes somewhere you never saw it going. And that's what brings fiction alive to me.
You've spoken of books being an important escape for you as a child, and if our math is right, you read up to 150 a year when you were young and first learning the craft. Authors like Charles Dickens, Flannery O'Connor, of course Dostoevsky, Ray Bradbury, T.S. Eliot, and John D. MacDonald. How were these and other authors, I'm sure, big influences on you as a reader growing up?
The first book I ever remember reading that struck me and really got me excited was The Wind in the Willows by Kenneth Grahame. And it's a children's book, but it's also more than that. And talk about a metaphysical undertone to any book. That one certainly has it. Then I gravitated pretty quickly after that to Ray Bradbury, Robert Heinlein, Theodore Sturgeon, science fiction writers who each in his own way was unique and was bringing something different. Bradbury brought to it the sense that you could have poetic writing, you could have metaphor and simile and beautiful use of the language in a genre where nobody expected it in those days. Heinlein, just that propulsive narrative that you just couldn't, you just grab hold of the reins and it would take you away. And Theodore Sturgeon, because he was strange, he would come up with strange ideas that nobody else was doing. And those three really impacted me when I look back on it. But a lot of writers impact you over the years. The one I became an adult before I think I found a writer who strongly influenced me, and that was John D. MacDonald, who, when I discovered him after college, I read 34 novels in 30 days. And then the first thing I wrote sounded so like a John D. MacDonald novel, I had to throw it away. It was embarrassing. So I was never forbidden to read anybody, but that wasn't because my parents had any idea about books. There were no books in our family. All they kept saying to me was, "You are so wasting your time. You should be learning how to repair a car, because now you should be doing this and you should be learning that. What are you ever going to get from books?" And that was the sort of level that the family was in. I remember my mother saying, "You better learn how to repair a car, because when you get older and have one, you won't be able to afford a mechanic." And I said, "Well, then I'm going to have to earn enough money to afford a mechanic, because I am never going to learn to repair an automobile." And that was such an outlandish idea in my family that any of us would ever have enough money to afford a mechanic. So the negativity of books was not that they might corrupt you, but that they were just wasting your time.
You've talked for years about the tremendous joy that you've taken in the use of language, and I imagine that started back as a child, playing with words instead of toys. We actually understand that you faked your own book reports in high school. Please tell us about that.
Well, first of all, let me clarify that faking book. Yes, I did. I've acknowledged this. I've admitted that I've not been shamefaced about it at all. Of course, I was sort of a little con man. I didn't want to read what was on who wants to read Silas Marner or anything when you're in 8th grade that they're trying to assign you. And so I just faked it. I pretended I read it by reading a paragraph here or there and then cobbling together a review. That expanded as the years went by in schools, where I would write reports for any class, not just English, on any subject and make up everything, and then cite books that I had created and authors' names who didn't exist, and cite where I found that information. I was never caught. I could have been a great criminal, I think, if the writing career hadn't gone well. So that was an exercise of imagination.
Oh.
That absolutely was. In high school, I had an English teacher, Winona Garbrick was her name. She had been a WAC in World War II, and I think a sergeant, and she was about 5'1". But everybody was terrified of her because she knew how discipline worked, and even giant football players went running in terror from her. She started chastising her, and somehow she took a shine to me, and nobody had prior to this. And she saw a writing ability, and she nurtured it for 4 years that she was my English teacher. And when I chose to major in history in college, she confronted me in the hall between classes one day and said, "I hear you're going to be taking history as a major. Why are you doing that? And I said, because I like history, and it's easy. And she said, that's why you're doing it. You're a born slacker. You need to take English because you have writing ability. And I changed my major. She did quite a lot to redirect my life. And then in college, I had a professor named Carl Campbell, whose philosophy about life was the opposite of about everyone else I was meeting in college. And I liked his being just an outrider of things. And he woke me to the idea you didn't have to believe what everybody else believed. And those people who sometimes don't know the effect they've had on you in life can be profound from just the smallest of things.
In fact, college would mark the first time you saw your name in print as a writer in your senior year at Shippensburg State College, when you entered and won a fiction contest in Atlantic Monthly magazine for a story called The Kittens. I assume you had your mind made up by then that you wanted to pursue a career as a professional writer.
It's called The Kittens. Yeah, I didn't enter the contest. I wrote that story for a short story class. And then I was one of the editors of the campus literary magazine. The counselor for that magazine submitted it to the Atlantic Monthly. And it was quite an event when I won a prize. That contest had gone on for decades, I guess, college writing, and no one in our college had ever won a prize. So when I did, it was late junior year. The greatest benefit of that, just frankly, was my senior year, I no longer had to work at all. I was such a star in the English department that I got straight A's, whether I did anything or not. I just loved that.
Rejection is, of course, a common experience we hear from your peers about authors going through when they're first starting out. In fact, famously, you sold the first short story you ever wrote, but then had the same experience as many of us do, receiving 75 rejections before another sale. You also tell a really touching story of after working as a teacher for a spell, your wife Gerda giving you a 5-year window of time to quote-unquote make it in the business, where you were free to write full-time, which actually led to the sale and publication of your first published novel, StarQuest.
Yeah, I had a little table in the kitchen in the apartment we had, and I wrote on that table. And mostly it was short stories. I was writing novels, but I couldn't sell them. But the short stories started showing up in magazines, and then finally that fifth novel, StarQuest. I sometimes say, why didn't I call it Star Wars or Star Trek? Or my sense of the correct title was way off base, I guess. But when that one sold, then gradually things started selling thereafter. I still had problems. Sometimes I'd have to put the book on a back burner and work on something else and go back to it. And it was during that period, really, I wasn't making a living, but that's when Gerda said, look, I know you don't want to be teaching school. I know you want to write for a living. I think you can do it. I'll give you 5 years and I'll support us. And if you can't make it in 5 years, you'll never make it. And I sometimes say I tried to negotiate her to 7, but she has Sicilian blood, so she wins every negotiation. There's never a horse's head in the bed, but you get the point anyway.
Turning to the realm of science fiction more fully, you really were on the cutting edge of a new generation of writers within this genre, bringing your own original visions from outer space to the magazine short story format, and then book after book in the late 60s and early 70s. Many of these short stories, in fact, became the inspiration for full-length books like Fear That Man, which originated in the idea from In the Shield and Where the Beast Runs, Beast Child, Anti-Man, which came from The Mystery of His Flesh, The Crimson Witch, Starblood, which originated from A Third Hand. And of course, then there's an entire era of standalone sci-fi novels that helped shape a new generation of readers and writers. Whether we're talking about The Fall of the Dream Machine, The Dark Symphony, Time Thieves, Warlocks, or Hell's Gate.
Well, let me say, first of all, that while I love reading science fiction, and I did enjoy writing it, there came a moment where I realized I wasn't ever going to be top of the line in science fiction. I lacked something you need for that. I didn't know what it was, but I saw that I was getting kind of lazy and disinterested in it. And that's when I left the genre and changed. But what I loved, sometimes when I look back on it, I realized many of my favorite things in the science fiction genre were not novel length. Theodore Sturgeon wrote things like It, which is a novelette that is chilling. And he wrote a number of things at that length, which were among his finest works. Uh, and then there were stories like Who Goes There by John Campbell, which was made into the movie The Thing, made into a better movie by John Campbell, or Carpenter, I think. And I love that novelette length. And now, as a late career, I've been doing a lot of things at novelette length in the English series and that. So I think what I liked about science fiction so much was the ideas, the strange ideas, the things nobody else was thinking about. And boom, here it is, and it captures your mind. But that wasn't enough for me to be great at it. If I could come up with those ideas, that was fine. But there's more than that to making great science fiction. And I wrote quite a few books in it, and they were all relatively short. One of them, Bee's Child, was a Hugo nominee. But eventually I took them all out of print. I repurchased the rights, or I got them out of license, and I just put them in a closet and said, I'm moving on from here. But still to this day, some of my favorite writers are in that field.
Well, there's no denying the influence that you had as a member of that new era of science fiction visionaries. And when you made what you call this shift, it was both genre blending and bending indeed in 1973, when you published the now long legendary Demon Seed, really credited as among the first books of the time to fuse science fiction and horror. Please share anything you would about the creation of this early masterpiece.
You know, it's so long ago that I'm not quite sure where the idea came from. But I remember I wrote it, I gave it to my agent. He submitted it, went to first to Bantam, which did actually buy it. And it was called The House of Night, and which is more of a horror title than it is a sci-fi title. And the editor there said, we can't call it House of Night. That sort of sounds like a house of prostitution or something. And I thought, well, Demon Seed doesn't exactly go in a totally different direction. And it was all kind of odd anyway, because I remember the editor's name was Alan Ravage. And that seemed odd that he would have that kind of reaction to the title. So I had to come up with another title. Years passed after the movie and everything else. When I went back to read it about possibly reissuing it, I said, whoa, the science in this is so far out of date. And I totally revised the novel and came up with whole different elements to it. And I liked the second version much more than the first.
During the same early era in your career in the 70s, you're widely credited with helping create yet another popular new genre, this time horror fiction, alongside other craft masters like Stephen King and Clive Barker. If we could delve into this classic part of your early catalog, we'd be grateful for fans and viewers if you'd be willing to reflect a bit on this new ground you broke by breaking the rules entirely, whether with new books like Night Chill, The Face of Fear, The Vision, or Voice of Midnight.
Yeah, in those days, I was fumbling. I was trying to find my way. Because as a reader, I read everything. Everything from Westerns to literary fiction to romances to science fiction to horror to suspense. And I hadn't realized it, but the way for me to succeed was going to be to pull those threads together and to start combining them in novels, those different genres. And so in trying to find my way, I wrote a comic novel that was well-reviewed and didn't sell. And somebody said, well, it's sold to a publisher, it was well-reviewed, but nobody in the public seemed to want to buy it. And an editor said to me, well, that's because nobody buys comic novels. And I said, well, then why are you having me write them? So I started at that point moving on. And that was when I moved into things like Face of Fear and The Vision. And if I look back on it, I was funneling my way toward melding genres together. And I only began to realize it consciously when publishers started to tell me, you can't do this. You can't have a suspense novel with a thread of humor in it because nobody will be on the edge of their seat if they're laughing now and then. And or you can't have a real well-rounded love story inside a thriller. And I bristled at that, as I had as a kid being told what I should read to learn how to do anything. And I think I'm a basically autodidact by nature. I'm happier to teach myself. And I started, I think, because they pushed back at my doing that, I started doing it more aggressively. And the interesting thing is, the more aggressively I did it, the more successful the books came. So by that time, I knew what I was doing, that I was combining these genres. And the sort of people have said I created the cross-genre novel. I think there were probably a couple of people did it before me and didn't get away with it, but I may have been the first one to get away with it. Convincing the reader that this is real, especially if it has an element of science fiction or an element of the supernatural. You've got to make that as real to the reader as anything else in a realistic novel. And those moments of how you do that are in your conscious mind, but your subconscious has more time to work on. And when you get to the moments you thought were problematic, they turn out not to be, because your subconscious starts giving you the answers to it.
For fans of Whispers, now mythic among your fans, please share a bit about your original muse for this book, which notably for viewers went on to become your first New York Times bestseller.
When Whispers came out, and my publisher had not given it any support, but it had sold over 1 million copies in paperback. And somehow or other, the publisher decided that was because horror was big and getting bigger, and Whispers was a horror novel. I never saw it as a horror novel. I saw it as in the Hitchcock vein. And they wouldn't pay me any serious money to live on unless I wrote something in the horror field. And that's how I started that way. And I said, all right, I'll give you one. When I turned that in, they wouldn't support it. The publisher wouldn't support it and said, I am so turned off by this book. It's really disgusting. This shape-changing creature is really, it's off-putting. And I said, oh, no. And my agent tried to explain to me, yes, you were asked to write horror, but you wrote something too horrifying. And then it succeeded in paperback, so we ended up tussling about other titles.
You've indicated a preference throughout your career of writing drafts of each page versus the more conventional approach, say of writing a chapter at a time before editing and rewriting. And as an expert at coming at it from any angle you want to, why does this approach work best for you throughout your catalog?
I think it comes out of self-doubt. I think all writer's block comes out of self-doubt. And I have as much or more self-doubt than any writer I've known. And that's never gone away, even all these years later. So when I get to the first page, I've got this self-doubt. And the only way I get to page 2 is I revise and revise and revise that first page till I can't make it any smoother. And then when that's done, I move on to page 2. And the self-doubt comes back and I go through that page. I might write it 10 times, 20, 30 times, polish it up and move forward. I have people say to me, well, then how do you keep story momentum? Well, if the story works, you keep the momentum. Those 10, 20 drafts will probably all take place in the same day. And you'll get your 3 or 4 pages out in 10 hours. It sounds grueling, but it works for me. And there is a side benefit to this that it took me years to, well, there's many benefits to it working this way. And then I get to the end of the chapter and I print it out and I pencil it up and a couple of times and make those changes. But one of the benefits is you have plenty of time to think about the story on a subconscious level. And on a conscious level, you've got problems selling this. I mean, convincing the reader that this is real.
If I may say so, you continued to churn out new books exponentially during this era under a number of pseudonyms and pen names, beginning in the 1970s and well into the 1980s, originally including Deanna Dwyer for Demon Child, Legacy of Terror, Children of the Storm, and The Darkest Summer, K.R. Dwyer for Chase, Shattered and Dragonfly, Anthony North for Strike Deep, John Hill for The Long Sleep, Aaron Wolfe for Invasion, David Axton for Prison of Ice, Brian Coffey for The Voice of the Night, Lee Nichols for The Keys to Midnight, The Eyes of Darkness, The House of Thunder, Twilight and Shadowfires, Owen West for The Mask, and Richard Page for The Door to December. I understand that you originally started taking the strategic tack because certain publishers would only put out certain styles under the Dean Koontz name. As the wizard working behind the curtain creating all of it, I imagine there was a certain creative freedom to being able to disappear behind the pen names into different places on the page than you might have otherwise gone in your own name at the time.
Character to me is the center of fiction. And if you love the characters, the story is important, the plot's important, it has to work, but it can be anywhere from pretty good to great. And the novel can still, for the reader, be a great experience if the characters are. Yeah, it's like this giant amount of people I've got to know, even though I'm sitting alone in a room most of my life. Sometimes I don't even think at all what they look like, but I kind of hear the way they talk.
By the dawn of the 1980s, Dean Koontz had become a household name around the world, courtesy of new bestsellers like The Funhouse and Phantoms. For viewers who might not know, is it true that this book was actually inspired in part by the work of H.G. Lovecraft?
To some extent, yes. And I also, as a kid, I loved these books by, I think his name was Frank Edwards, who corrected these true stories of strange things in the world. And about disappearances like Judge Crater or the Rona colony and stuff like that. So partly it came out of trying to answer that question.
You've highlighted The Strangers as the book that liberated you from outlines.
I can remember when I delivered Strangers, and I was told, oh, it was 940 manuscript pages. And they said to me, and it had almost no margins. So there were a lot of text on the page. And they said, you're going to have to cut 400 pages out of this, but we will publish it. And I was not going to cut 400 pages out of it. But the argument was too many characters for a thriller. The themes were too complex for a thriller, blah, 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 all these things. And it had this that a thriller shouldn't have and that. And that began arguments at Putnam that went on for years. It was the size of the cast. There were so many characters in so many locations, all of them working in a story that is going to bring them together. And that was exciting. That was challenging. That was a point in a career where I think for the first time, I consciously realized that the best thing you could do to sustain a long career, because a lot of writers tend to burn out. They tend to get bored, and it starts becoming by rote. And the way to avoid that, and the way to avoid readers feeling that, is to challenge yourself with something that you think, I don't know if I can pull that off. And in Strangers, that was surely the case. I didn't know if I could pull off all these varied characters in all these different locations, which required huge amounts of research and thoughts. Could I make that happen? And that was the exciting part of it, because if you're walking a wire and you know you could fall, you're not going to die, but you're going to embarrass the hell out of yourself, which in some cases seems almost as bad. Then let's try. Let's risk falling flat on my face. And that makes the writing exciting, I think, for the reader as much as the writer.
Watchers would go on to spark a 4-book franchise, but your readers were the first to meet the super scary Tranquility community. Please introduce them, if you would, to readers and viewers who haven't met them yet.
In Strangers was the first book that I did something that I've done a lot of since that I didn't know I was doing. And that was taking people in some situations who either have no family or lost their family, and through the story, build a new family of people they meet and become deeply attached to. And there was a kernel of that in Strangers. And then as we come to Watchers, we open with a guy who's contemplating suicide because his life is so far off the rails. And we have a woman who lives under the thumb of a vicious relative and a lone dog, and they come together to form this family. And then this whole family at the end of the novel that's expanded beyond that. And I've done this again and again. And I didn't know at first I was doing this. And then an editor said to me, "You do this often?" And I said, "It's not a bad thing." She said, "Because it's always different stories, but it's an interesting character thing that you're creating families in the course of these stories." And I stopped it, and I couldn't believe she'd said that. I couldn't believe it was true. And then I realized it was. And I then immediately realized it was because I had never had a family life of any satisfaction. It was a dysfunctional family. My father was a violent alcoholic. I had yearned for a family that was like what I write about, but it never happened for me in childhood and adolescence. So sometimes you're writing out of things deep within you that you don't even know you're tapping. And that's where sort of all that element of these books, I think, comes from.
How wild was it to watch pop culture fully embrace your books in the 80s and then 90s when Hollywood began adapting them into movies? I can think of Whispers, The Watchers 1, 2, 3, and 4, The Face of Fear, Intensity, Mr. Murder, and Phantoms, among others. Did you have any favorites you most enjoyed seeing in the theater when they came out?
The first one was, of course, Demon Seed, and that's a fairly decent film. And so I was happy with that. Who can't be happy with Julie Christie's in your movie? And then I went into TV. I wrote a number of scripts, TV, pilot scripts and things. Everything I ever wrote was greenlighted, which is supposedly rarely happens. But most of it fell apart because, well, the director was on cocaine or shot his wife or whatever, something went wrong, and things fall apart for different reasons. But there was one TV thing called Face of Fear that I thought was pretty nicely done by a director named Farhad Mann, who I'm still friendly with after all these years. But then we got into things like Watchers, which was 4 movies, actually. I wouldn't call them movies, I'd call them excretions. But it was, that's the great tragedy. I think that book just shouted out for a wonderful movie, and it never got one. It got these kind of Roger Corman things that I almost gave up the whole idea of films after that. Hideaway, I remember when Hideaway had just come out, I wasn't on TV promoting Hideaway. I was on TV for something else. Greg Kinnear had a talk show in those days, and he's a very sweet guy in my experience, very nice. And I was on his show, and we were talking about this or that. He said, Hideaway has just come into theaters, or it was just, and should your readers go to see it? And I was unfortunately terribly honest. I said, well, if you have the choice of going to see this movie or nailing your hand to the table, nail your hand to the table. It'll be more fun, which got a laugh. It probably wasn't good in terms of the studio reaction to me, but it was true. It was not a particularly wonderful movie. I think we've got a lot of things in the pipeline now, 5 different TV series in development that are with a quality of production people that I think is going to make a difference. I had a great time, by the way, with Steve Sommers on Odd Thomas, and he wrote the most brilliant script. But halfway through the production, he was told that the money had run out, or that something had happened to the money. Nobody could explain it. And he had to shut the production down for a month, keep everybody in New Mexico, and try to raise the funds to finish it, which he raised enough to finish it, but not as much as the original budget. So he had to cut his script up. But he was the nicest man. I think he decided after that experience to stay out of movies. I haven't seen him around since. But if he could have shot his script, that would have been a fabulous movie. And it was still pretty darn good, considering he made it for less than you would imagine when you saw the quality of what he put on the screen.
Every author we've spoken to for the show fights with the publisher over at least one book in their career that they really believe in, and at first the publisher doesn't quite see fitting within readers know to be that author's native genre. In your case, it was Lightning, and you really fought for this book's publication. Do you feel like that was risky at all, or had you become established enough by that point that you could afford to spend that kind of capital with a publisher if you really believed in a book like you did in this one?
When I delivered Lightning, my publisher told me, "You're getting on the bestseller list now. This book will destroy your career forever," and wanted me to put it on the shelf for 5 years, and I'll publish it in 5 years. I think 7 years, and then I'll publish it because it won't matter. And I thought, why? And she gave me reasons that were among these. Well, it's got humor in it. You can't do that in a thriller or a scary story. and the lead character is a child for the first quarter of the book. That makes it a young adult novel. All these things that simply were common wisdom, except they're common, but they're not wise. And I was able to argue that. It took 6 months of my refusing to take that book out of the schedule. And finally, they said, okay, this will be the next book, but you're done, you're finished. That was the book. The very next one after that went to #1. And that's because people really like lightning.
You've also identified this book as the one where you began being a little bit freer with humor in a suspense novel. Please talk about that if you would.
There was a lot of resistance to that too, but that's the idea that if you're laughing, you can't be afraid. And well, of course you're laughing at the character, but at the same time, you don't want to see him torn apart by the monster that's lurking around the corner.
You kicked off the 1990s casting as large a shadow as ever and pushing new boundaries as you always had with new books like The Bad Place, which notably marked another new genre blend for you, this time of suspense and science fiction. When did the concept first come to you to set a detective story featuring a husband and wife private eye pair on an alien planet?
I love that book. I tell you several little different things about it. When I delivered it, my agent at that time, who eventually left, but I was with for 14 years, called me up and said, I love this book, but something in it is absolute genius. And I said, oh, what is that? And she said, the scenes from the point of view of the Down syndrome boy are just absolute genius. I've never seen anything like it. I think this is magnificent. And I said, you know what? I love that character so much. And I loved creating his viewpoint and his language that I thought I should write an entire novel from the point of view of a Down syndrome boy. And she was very silent for a moment. And then she said, there's such a thing as too much genius. So I put that idea on hold. Then my publisher at the time was the sequence you mentioned, which suddenly this PI novel with supernatural seeming elements to it has a scene on another planet. And I didn't know this till after the novel had reached #1 and was a hit. But my editor at the time said, oh, you should have heard the publisher when she read this manuscript. She was screaming in the hall, he's taken them to another planet. It's not that kind of novel. But it's that kind of thing and pulling it off that I think makes readers really dedicated to what you're doing. They know you're writing it for yourself and for them, not just to make money. Because if you're writing just to make money, you would follow a formula.
Verse inventing them like you have time and again. And there's a real argument to be made that if you hadn't done them first, it wouldn't have sent the signal to other authors that followed you into that new territory that it was okay to go there in the first place. You've also said as you write, you like prose to have hidden rhythms and called it one of the greatest techniques to suck the reader right into the heart of the story that you have in your toolkit. Using another era of bestsellers like Dragonfly, Cold Fire, Hideaway, Dragon Tears, Mr. Murder, Dark Rivers of the Heart, Intensity, TikTok, Soul Survivor, and False Memory as examples of that dance in action on the keyboard. Would you elaborate a bit on how these different poetic meters sound inside your head to you as you're first creating them, versus when we get to hear them, so to speak, within the writing as we read?
I'm always aware of the rhythm of the language. And I think that's partly because, and that really started to matter to me probably in my 30s. And it didn't matter to me in early years or anything, but I have become over the course of my adult life a very heavy reader of poetry. And as a consequence, it starts you thinking in a different way about the language. And not just so that it sounds pretty, because what the real strength of poetry does is succinct expression. Poetry with its imagery, with its use of language, with its rhythms, can do things to the reader, can convey ideas much more compactly than are often conveyed within a novel. And at some point in my 30s, I started to think about that. And I started to realize that if I could take all the techniques of poetry and begin to use them in writing fiction, this was also going to make the fiction more powerful, more effective, and potentially even somewhat more succinct. Yeah, that in a 100,000 word novel, you might do what you used to do in that 200,000 word novel. It wouldn't be any quicker or easier to write. It would just be more impactful to read. That was my hope. And over the years, that's where I've drifted. I once mentioned a scene in a novel that was almost entirely written iambic pentameter, and nobody notices these things. And it's not, they shouldn't necessarily. You're trying to speak to them on that other level that is almost subconscious, the same way you do when you're putting those as subtextual things into a novel that support the themes you hope you're addressing, which instead of calling them subtextual elements, people now call them Easter eggs, I think. But that's just simplifies what they're called, but it doesn't state how subtextually important they are. All of that matters a lot to me anymore, and makes the writing such a bigger adventure than it would have been otherwise.
You've highlighted Fear Nothing and Seize the Night from the Moonlight Bay series as two of your favorites. What did you most enjoy about this series, and when can fans expect to get their hands on the long-awaited completion of the trilogy with Ride the Storm?
Well, I started Ride the Storm. This sounds like I'm endlessly complaining. I've had good editors, good publishers, and bad, and I have a great team now at Thomas & Mercer and Amazon. It's such enthusiasm and intelligence that I'm happier than I've been in a long time. But in that case, I delivered the second season of what was supposed to be a trilogy. I was working on Ride the Storm while the publisher was reading Seize the Night, and the reaction to Seize the Night was not good. Came back with real demands that I change the entire ending of the book. And I couldn't, because to change the ending, I have to go back and change much else that happens in the book. And I didn't see any value in changing it. I made slight editorial changes to satisfy the publisher. It basically boiled down to, he thought the ending had too much humor in it. The banter between Bobby and Chris, and especially when Bobby is dying, it's not a spoiler. It doesn't quite turn out that way. And they still have this back and forth between each other that's funny. He couldn't understand that, couldn't live with it. And it was so painful to take out any of that humor. That's all I did. I think I may have deleted 2 pages or so, bits of dialogue. And I thought, he so hates this that if I deliver the third one, that's going to be it. I'm going to have to get to a different publisher. And I had only shortly before left Koontz, and I didn't want to change publishers. So I decided I'd write 1 or 2 other books and then go back to Ride the Storm. And I never managed to go back. Now those books are stuck at another publisher. And if I write a third, I still may do it. I'm trying to find a way to do it that if you never read the first 2, you would still understand them like the third one. And there may be a way to do that.
You spotlighted 3 books released at the dawn of the millennium: One Door Away from Heaven, From the Corner of His Eye, and The Face, as among the favorites you most enjoyed from the standpoint of creating the always memorable cast of characters that you populated their pages with. Any personalities among those you fell most in love with as you were writing them?
I think it almost always, for me, that when I had great fun writing something, it was because of the characters. And that book has so many characters that I fell in love with. Curtis, who is something more than he appears to be, and Leilani Klonk, the disabled girl, and my female lead, who has had a bad beginning to her life. She's in her late 20s and is just out of prison. Her aunt, of all the people, and it's big cast of characters and very colorful. And I just loved being with each character. I was so into each character that when I had to leave a scene with Curtis to go to a scene with Leilani, I didn't regret it because I wanted to see what Leilani was doing. Certainly, a number of those are vivid in my mind, From One Door Away from Heaven. Also, in From the Corner of His Eye, Barty and his mother, the villain in that book, Junior Kane, is so vivid in my mind still. Those two novels were very similar in that they're about totally different things and different storylines, but they have that enormous cast and these very out there ideas presented as if they're just as real as anything else you would read. And I had such a great good time with both of them that they stick in my mind. The characters in Face, Frick and the detective Evan, that is pulled into that boy's story. I've mentioned this before. I'll keep it short. I was working on The Face. I was halfway through it. It's like a 250,000-word novel. So halfway through, it still leaves a lot of territory. And into my head came the line, "My name is Odd Thomas. I lead an unusual life." That had nothing to do with The Face.
Another key Dean Koontz signature that's woven its way throughout your entire catalog has been the use of real-life scientific disaster or phenomena as plot points or backdrops to the books that followed. What have you most enjoyed throughout your career? Say about a germ you read in the newspaper or hear about on TV that then winds up in one of your books, or even as a plot to one of them.
One book that I remember, because it was what started me on the novel, was the idea. I read a lot of science, and quantum mechanics especially fascinates me. And I thought one day, wow, that aspect of quantum mechanics that tells us the world is so integrated that, this is an adjunct to quantum mechanics, the butterfly effect, that a flight of butterflies in Japan affects the weather in Chicago. And it's well known that if two identical experiments are done, one in LA and one in New York, and both labs know the experiments being done at the same time, an event in one lab will affect the experiment in the other lab. That's how the world is connected. On a deep level, we, as Richard Feynman said, we don't understand. Nobody understands quantum mechanics. We know it's real. We know it works, but it's so mysterious. And I thought one day, that's exactly true of human relationships. Something you do that seems unimportant, that maybe is a nasty thing, or maybe is a nice thing, reflects and ricochets through lives you'll never know. Somebody you did a nice thing for may do a nice thing to somebody else. This is a very simplifying way of putting it. Or somebody who did something nasty to may be put into a bad mood and do something they shouldn't have done. And how this bounces and reflects, like particles bouncing off each other and changing the nature of the material. That's what's happened in life among human beings. And I thought, how the hell do I show that in the novel? And that became From the Corner of His Eye, which is, I think, probably the longest novel I've written. But I think that got pulled off.
The Odd Thomas book series is one that millennials have kept in high demand over the last 20 years. When did Odd first walk out of the creative mist and onto the page, so to speak? And you talked about loving this character and story so instantly that you knew Odd Thomas was going to be a series from the first time you finished the first chapter of the first self-titled novel. What within that span of pages let you know that so quickly?
Odd Thomas will always stick with me, and many of the characters, supporting characters in that series. I thought, Odd Thomas, where did he come from? And I turned to a tablet, which I keep notes beside my computer. Don't forget to go back and do this or whatever. And I started to write that line out. The next thing I knew, I was writing longhand. Never before or since have I written anything longhand. My handwriting is sort of like that of Bigfoot. That's not particularly readable. And I started, but I couldn't stop. I spent the day and the next day just writing in longhand. Ended up with 30 some legal pads full of my handwritten first scene of that novel, first chapter. And I was in love with the character at that point because of how he spoke and how he saw the world and how you got into his world so quickly. Then I had to go back and finish The Face so I could write Odd Thomas. And where he came from, I haven't the slightest idea. That's one of the things I love so much about this is you'll be working on something and into your head comes a character, a moment, and it's nothing you planned, and sometimes an entire novel. And you can't say, where did this come from? And even years later, as you go back to analyze, you don't know where it came from. That is a mystical experience on itself, and one of the most exciting things that happens when you're writing.
Did you know early on as a key feature of his personality and reality that he would see ghosts? And who are a few of the favorite ones that he can see? Elvis Presley definitely comes to mind, and then of course there's Frank Sinatra, who shows up a little later on in the series, and then Alfred Hitchcock. It must have been so much fun to resurrect these real-life characters from history in your own vision as you were writing the series.
Yeah, the idea somehow, that was when I was handwriting it out, and knew that he was going to be sort of the mentor to Elvis's ghost, that Elvis was unable to move on from this world, and it was going to fall to Odd Thomas to just sort of counsel him and help him on. I thought, this is really out there. This is a strange idea. But as I started to write it, it was so much fun. And of course, I don't know, I guess this was intuitive, that I knew I didn't want to have Elvis talking. So it would have to be that Odd sees ghosts and they know he sees them and they hang out with him and they communicate with him by gesture and this and that, but they aren't going to talk. Odd says, the dead don't talk. I don't know why. And I knew why, because I didn't want to have to be locked into the historical voice of that character. But Elvis was a lot of fun. And I knew at some point Elvis had to be allowed to move on. And I thought, okay, now the books aren't going to have any companion with Odd that is on the other world. He'll just have ghosts that come and go. And then I had him walking down the highway. I suddenly started laughing out loud when I knew who was walking beside him. It was Frank Sinatra. So yeah, it was great fun.
As the prolific run that follows proved over the course of Forever Odd, Brother Odd, Odd Hours, Odd Interlude, Odd Apocalypse, Deeply Odd, you are destined to be together forever in Saint Odd. What was it like to grow with and get to know this character as well as I'm sure you did over the arc of this series?
First one is it's where you meet the character, so it's hard ever to beat that one. But I think certain of the other books worked exceedingly well from my perspective, what I was trying to achieve. And there was a little hiatus because, again, publisher did not particularly like Odd Thomas. In that case, because to the publisher's mind, that's not what an action hero is like. An action hero has lots of guns. He's 6'4". He's buff. He's not a fry cook in a restaurant. And so it violated all the rules. And it was so in opposition to what my publisher thought an action hero should be like that he would not talk to me about that book. It was left to my editor as the only one who was talking to me about it. And when I said I would like to write more about Odd Thomas, I had to strike a deal. All right, but you have to give me one not Odd Thomas book between each Odd Thomas. And then when the book Odd Thomas came out, I think we had like 120 or 30 reviews, and only one or two that were bad or even indifferent. And booksellers ordered in greater volume than they'd ordered before. And it was like this wake up, oh, well, I guess maybe other people find this believable and appealing. But it really didn't have anything to do with believability. It had to do with the preconceived notion of what any action hero has to be like. And that Odd was nothing like that. It was something that I had to get past with some people.
Well, you certainly did that. Your Frankenstein series would prove to be another of your most popular of the millennium so far. What first inspired you to want to do your own original take on this horror classic and the books that followed like Prodigal Son, City of Night, Dead and Alive, Lost Souls, and Dead Town? And what kind of research did you do, if any, into the history of Frankenstein before you began working on this project?
A couple of producers came to me, an agency I was with, introduced me to a producer and said, I think the two of you will get along well, and he has an idea for you. And the idea, he and his partner, they came down here to Orange County and we spent an afternoon. And their idea was, we want you to reconceive Dracula. And I said, oh, 200 people have reconceived Dracula. Every 5 years, somebody reconceives Dracula and the vampire idea. Why don't we do something different? Why don't we reconceive the Frankenstein thing? So they bought into that. I wrote our pilot script. It sold to USA Network, cable network. They asked me to expand the pilot into a 2-hour movie that would launch the series. As I was doing that, as I delivered it, they were getting a director, and they got a director who was a directed commercials and had done a remake of Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And I said, no, that isn't what this is. It isn't what I do. I'm not a gore writer. And but he was there. They hadn't made a deal yet. And then the head of the agency sent my 2-hour script to Martin Scorsese, who was looking for something to direct for TV in the fiction area. He had done documentaries, and he came back and said, I want to do this. And then he found out that they had another director. They hadn't yet closed the deal, but they were in negotiations with. And he said, I'll never take work away from a young director. So he came on as a producer. And I thought, wow, we got an 800-pound gorilla in this project. It can't go wrong. Well, it went spectacularly wrong. And Marty turned out to be an absolute sweet man. I have a beautiful letter from him about how appalled he was at what the cable channel did to the series. I had to take my name off it. I had to take my name off creator, original screenwriter, everything. And then I just had this urge to say, here's the way it could have been done, because the 2-hour pilot failed utterly, and they never did make the series. But I wanted to get out there at the original idea. So I ended up writing these 5 novels and had a lot of fun with them. Those books were an enormous amount of fun to write. And they create a character I'll never forget. He shows up in the second book, I think it is Jocko. He's an inadvertent creation of Frankenstein, and he's quite amusing. So that's how all those books came about, out of the failed TV project.
What's been your favorite part of writing a strong female protagonist like Jane Hawk, who stars in her own series with The Silent Corner, The Whispering Room, The Bone Farm, Crooked Staircase, The Forbidden Door, and The Night Window?
I knew all I knew about Jane was I wanted her to be, to some extent a tragic figure, because there was some tragic loss in her past. I wanted you to really identify with her, not as a victim. I wanted you to identify with her as a kick-ass, as somebody who was going to be far beyond what other female characters have been in that kind of story. And I didn't know much other than the background to this series of this nanotech horror that is about to be spawned upon the world. And she would be this disgraced FBI agent on the run when the story opens. And I had her in a motel room, and I thought, how do I start conveying who this woman is? And the very opening page or two, she just bloomed in my mind. And eventually, I think it was around the 3rd book, my editor on these called me up after reading, I guess it would have been, I think it was book 3. It wasn't The Whispering Room, Crooked Staircase, and said, I love these books, but my favorite thing is how she talks to bad guys. And I burst out laughing because I said, I love writing those scenes. The way she talks to bad guys, she is so intimidating. And yet, and she doesn't have to really do much to them. The threat that she poses is, in her quiet, sort of intense way, worse than anything she could actually do to them. And then sometimes she really does bad things to them. But yeah, she's one of my favorite characters of anything I've ever done. The Jane Hawk, by the way, is one of the 5 TV series in development, so I've got high hopes for that.
In the same way, you've talked about letting the characters lead you as you're writing. And along with, say, Odd Thomas or Jane Hawk, who've been any others across your catalog you stayed friends with, so to speak, in your imagination, even after their books were published? Ashley Bell comes right to mind.
I loved Ashley Bell.
To make sure for fans that we're covering the entire catalog, let's take a look at a few more of your Millennium bestsellers, like Life Expectancy, Velocity, The Husband, The Good Guy, The Darkest Evening of the Year, and What the Night Knows, to demonstrate your timeless talent for traveling anywhere you wish to on the page, while continuing to blend genres like science fiction and horror, for instance, in a fresh new way for the reader. Please talk a bit about how that process works, if you would. Maybe using 77 Shadow Street is another great example.
I think in that case, it was, I wanted to write a story where it wouldn't be set in the far, far future. It would be set in our time, but you'd start getting glimpses of some far, far future that evolved out of our time. And it would evolve out of not the threats we think are facing us, but from something else we do that we think we've done a good thing, or a science that has been developed to answer a threat and becomes the threat itself that destroys us. And I thought that was such a cool idea that I couldn't get out of my head. If you can't get it out of your head, then you got to write it. So I wrote it. Whether it's one of the better things I've done or not, I don't think so, but I enjoyed writing it.
Were you still working at a horseshoe-shaped desk when you wrote the wonderful recent releases Elsewhere and Devoted?
Yes, I do. Yeah, I like to have that surround where I can pile up all the different reference materials. Online referencing is good. You can look up anything online, but I give it to my assistant to look up because I personally never go online in my office because I understand what an obsessive compulsive person I am. And if I went online once, I'd probably never get any more writing done. I have a novel that's sort of in that kind of vein called The Big Dark Sky that's coming out later this year. And there's some characters in that I had great fun with. There are animals, there are bacteria, and then there is a life form called archaea, which is thought to be bacteria but isn't. They have just discovered in the past couple of decades that this life form, which is a microbe, can transfer DNA from one species to another. So what role it plays in life, nobody fully understands, but it gave me the idea for Devoted. It gave me a little bit of something for The Other Emily. And right now, it's given me an entire novel. That little thing that I read in science and I wanted to know more about has fostered 3 totally different kind of novels. And I use it in different ways. So I don't go looking for material to find ideas. It just comes when you do that reading.
I imagine it also keeps it exciting for you when you flip back and forth between standalones and then other series like Nameless, which Amazon recently released and features in Season 1 In the Heart of Fire, Photographing the Dead, The Praying Mantis Bride, Red Rain, The Merciest Snakes, and Memories of Tomorrow, or in Season 2, The Lost Soul of the City, Gentle as the Angel of Death, Kaleidoscope, Light as Weight but Darkness Does Not, Corkscrew, and Zero In. I have to imagine you have a few favorites among those you most enjoyed creating.
Amazon Original Stories came to me, and I did a story for them called Ricochet Joe, and it did very well. So they came back and said, why don't you do some novelettes? And earlier we talked about that is a favorite form of mine as a reader, with the same character, and that became Nameless. And I did those, and they were looking for one number of downloads in the first year, and they had, I think, almost double or 2.5 times that many. And then they asked me to do Season 2. We both agreed 2 was going to be the end of it. And now it's this TV series in development with Henry Golding to star in it, who is the star of Crazy Rich Asians and a number of other things now. On his way up big time, I think. And those were enormous fun to do, partly because there was so much enthusiasm for it at Amazon Original Stories. And as I would deliver them, they would get this, have these wonderful reactions to them. And when I decided I needed to refresh my career about who published me and departed my former publisher, we went out on the market. We had 8 offers, and my agent said, let's put Amazon in this, not Amazon Original Stories, the animated novel, short stories, but Amazon Thomas and Mercer for novels. And I was a little not sure at first, but that's where I ended up going, largely because of their enthusiasm, which they conveyed so brilliantly. And as I've been there, it has been, you talk about all these new ideas coming. It really helps when you're in a situation where everyone you're dealing with is very creative, very enthusiastic, and very much wants all this to succeed. So, it's odd because Amazon books don't get counted on bestseller lists, but for the most part. So we're selling very well, but we're not on this list. But that doesn't really matter. And one reason all these new ideas are coming to me is this surrounded by intelligent, enthusiastic people. And I had the intelligence before. I don't know that as years were going by, I still had the kind of enthusiasm. Publishers are always, I think, looking for something new. And as you get to be of a certain age, they think, oh, you're going to be worn out in no time. And I think you can be if you fall into that kind of thinking that they bring to how they promote you. But now that's not how I'm being promoted. It's not how I'm being packaged. Thomas Mercer did beautiful editions with illustrated end papers and all kind of fine little wonderful points of production to them that I, as a book collector, love. So it's really energized me, and ideas are coming to me faster and bigger than they ever have.
What's coming up on the silver screen and in the streaming universe next within this latest era of your new books and series that are being adapted, say, either to film or to television that you can tell us a bit about?
Nameless was widely announced. Devoted is out there. I don't know if I'm supposed to talk about a couple of the others, which are,
okay.
Yeah. So, but they're all more recent things, which is what's interesting about them.
You sustained a rare 6-decade career by sticking to your winning formula of shaking it up whenever you wanted from book to book, writing across different genres versus pigeonholing yourself into one. And titles like Quicksilver and The Big Dark Sky are great examples of why. Why do you feel like this approach has consistently worked so well for you creatively and commercially?
I tend to do 2 books a year, but I work 60 hours a week or 70, sometimes more. So it's a lot of work to get 2 out, but it's also play. It's fun as well as artwork. I've got a book called The Big Dark Sky. This comes out of a fascination with synchronicity, these coincidences, incredible coincidences that are inexplicable. And I've collected them over the years and been fascinated with it. And I thought, well, why don't you write a novel that says incredible coincidences or synchronicity aren't coincidences at all? And of course, quantum mechanics would sort of argue the same thing, that there are no such things as coincidences. But how do you tell that in a novel, and especially a novel that's not 200,000 words, but 100,000 words with multiple characters? And that sort of is where that story came from. And it's got some characters I love. That comes out in the summer of 2022. And after that, a novel about a woman alone on an island who's had something so bad in her past that it takes 120 some pages for you to learn about what it is. But she has isolated herself to be on this island away from humanity because she's lost faith in humanity. And something very bad happens on this island. So.
Now that you're at the point in your storied career where you have over 500 million readers and counting that have read your books around the world, it must make you feel good to know that they've resonated with fans across so many generations and genres so thoroughly that they have a permanent place on their bookshelf. Do you ever stop periodically and reflect on that, given how many groundbreaking chances you pulled off, doing things in what was truly a bold and uncompromising way on the page for so many years?
Well, we've actually been at 500 million for some time now. And it's very strange. I've said that when Jared and I sat down to say, okay, how much do you have to earn a year for this to work? And this is way, way back when this was more than it then than now. It was 25,000, and that would have meant I never hit the bestseller list. I never contemplated it. So the fact that it evolved the way that it did is endlessly fascinating to me, and I'm grateful for it. I never saw it coming. I never saw it continuing, and yet we're doing very well all these years later. I will say that something I'm glad I did is all the way back in Midnight. I started using people with various disabilities as characters in a novel. And to that point, they had never, you didn't see that in a novel. You didn't see a paraplegic or a Down syndrome person in a novel unless the novel was about their affliction or about what they suffer. And in my case, they're just other characters in the story. And when I started doing it, there was resistance to that. There was a lot of resistance to that in the film world. When they adapted Hideaway, I had a little girl with deformed hand, wore a leg brace. And I remember being in a production meeting in which they said, we're going to have to change that for the screenplay. Well, it was in a story meeting, not production. We're going to have to change that for the screenplay. And I said, why? They said, audience will be repelled by a character who has a deformity. And I was so incensed by the word repelled that I tried to say, look, we work with this charity called Canine Companions for Independence. I've met hundreds of people with severe disabilities. Every single one of them was an optimistic, forward-thinking person. None of them whined about their affliction. And they're more interesting than what their disability is. And that's why I want to use them in stories. Well, they ended up changing that character in the movie. But when I have a character like that in the book, at first there was a resistance to it for much that same reason in publishing, but that has gone away. And I think it's because I've done it so often in its work that nobody thinks about it anymore.
Now that it's become a tradition for kids to pull your books off their parents' shelves when they're first learning to read, becoming lifelong fans thereafter, without sounding too cliche, does it really feel like a family with your fans?
It surprised me when it started to happen years ago. And I had readers for 25 years or 30. And then I'd start getting letters from 11-year-olds. And I would think, I'm not so sure 11-year-olds should be reading my books. And these letters often turned out to be more articulate and interesting than the letters from the adults. So I said, okay, we never know. Sometimes 11-year-old can be pretty mature. And I swear this is where this comes from. I have gotten, I can't tell you how many letters, well over 1,000, probably over 2,000 letters from dyslexics who have written me to say, yours were the first novels I've ever been able to read. And I hated reading. And then one day, somebody gave me one, or somebody said, try this, or I tried it and I could read it and it flowed and it went so easy and I had no problems. And after I read several of yours, I could read other novels. And I think that has something to do with my obsession about making the prose flow. And it also raises an issue for me. What does that say dyslexia is if it can be to some extent cured by that method?
You started writing books about writing decades ago with titles like How to Write Best-Selling Fiction and Writing Popular Fiction. Mining from both of those and from your extensive teachings over the years, what are a few bedrock basics you'd share from the Dean Koontz School of Writing here?
Well, we all have different ways to write, and I never learned anything in writing course that was useful to me, but other people have. So I just don't necessarily give that kind of writing advice. One thing I do say I think is important is when you have decided this is what you want to do, you have to understand it is hard to break through. And it's harder now than it ever was to break through in a meaningful way. And as a consequence, I've known a lot of young writers who come to it by scoping the market. They want to look around like this and see what's selling, what do they want, and then that's what I'll write. It's a disastrous way to do it. You have to write what you love and what you think nobody else can do quite as well as you think you can do it. You may be wrong. There may turn out to be a lot of people write it better than you do, but it is still something you love to write. That has to come first. And even if what you love to write isn't anything you see them publishing, because the other side of that coin is you spend a couple of years writing what you think they want, and the taste has changed and nobody wants that anymore. So you'd have been much better off trying to create your own way. And that is the best piece of advice I can give anyone. That's because you're writing it out of passion. You're writing it because you can't not do this. Well, that's very true of me. I have no other talent, skill, or ability. Zero, zip, nada. You can talk to my wife, she'll confirm that. My assistant is right in the room, she'll confirm that. So if this didn't work, nothing else would. And you have to go at it with that attitude. Even if you do have other talent, skills, and ability, pretend that you don't. Pretend that it's this or living on the street in a shopping cart. And that will motivate you to stay with it to the level you need to make it work.
What about any tips specifically from the field of writing horror fiction? Coming from a genre pioneer like you, we're sure it would be appreciated for the aspiring author who might be watching.
The unexpected. There need to be those twists that you don't see coming. In intensity, for instance, when China, after a significant period of time, she escapes the house in which the serial killer has murdered everyone else. And she realizes she accidentally ends up in his motorhome before she realizes he's coming out of the house, and now she's trapped in it. He doesn't know she's in it, and they're on the road. And then he stops for gas, and she has an opportunity to get out. But something happens that she realizes where he's going is to where he lives, and he's got a young girl captive there. And if she lets him go, nobody will ever know about that young girl. And she gets back into the motor. That moment, when I was writing, I had to get up and walk around the room. I thought, no, she can't do that. If those kind of moments in a story like that is what readers need, then you have to sell it. Would she do this? And it comes out of her background. And I'll have no more spoilers on that novel. But those are important things. But having characters that the reader comes to deeply care about, I think, is the most important thing, because if the characters aren't really appealing on a major level, and that doesn't mean they don't have flaws. They can have all kinds of flaws, but they're trying to overcome them. Those characters matter. That's what carries you through the novel and makes you afraid, because you're not reading the novel afraid for yourself as you're sitting in your cozy apartment or whatever. You're afraid for the character in the story, so you better like them.
Do you feel like that's true of the antagonists as well, that you need to understand their point of view to write it? After all, you've created so many of the truly compelling and yet creepy ones over the years.
Yeah, and that doesn't mean that life has been unjust to them. My characters are often sociopaths, and it isn't society or their parents. I've done that. That's true in Whispers. It's the home he grows up in that turns him into what he is. But sometimes it's nature, and evil is real. And but when you do that sociopath, then find that thing about him that makes him different from Hannibal Lecter or from all the other ones we've seen. And because sociopaths on one level are all the same, each one of them, nevertheless, can have their own strange obsession. And there's a way to get into them that makes each one of those unique as well.
What about any that scared you while you were writing them, long before they did readers?
I think the sociopath intensity is right up there. Junior Cain in From the Corner of His Eye, largely because Junior is pretty funny, but he doesn't know it. He has no sense of humor, but he is so so out there that you've got to laugh at him at times. And but nevertheless, he remains very scary. So he remains in my mind. There's a number of them. So if I started that, I think we'd be here another 20 minutes.
In closing, it sounds like fans can expect to keep reading your books for years to come.
I said jokingly when I was in my 50s and people would say, when are you going to retire? I said, when I fall dead into the keyboard. And here I am, 76, and I haven't fallen dead yet. And I hope not to, because I'm still having too much fun at it.
Mr. Koontz, you're a national literary treasure across so many genres and generations, and we're so grateful that you took out time today to unpack it all here with us. Thank you for being on About the Authors TV. It would not have been complete without you.
Take care.